Well, good afternoon, fellow Earthlings. Here we are in Washington, D.C., planet Earth, surrounded by some 200 billion stars of our own Milky Way galaxy. And on out in the universe, there's an estimated 100 billion other galaxies, each one containing several hundred billion stars. And lately, the scientific evidence is showing that probably every one of those stars has one or two planets on average. And sometimes when you look at the stars at night, we're reminded of some really important questions. What is our human place in the universe? Are we humans alone in the universe? Who are we humans really? And those questions are at the core of the reasons for sending an internationally supported mission to our next door neighbor planet Mars. And I'm talking about sending humans, not robots. And if we do that, it will help civilize Earth in these ways. Lift human life to a higher level of authenticity, cultivate a global human identity core, increase our human self-esteem and confidence, share mission costs among nations, encourage worldwide science education, create jobs and prosperity, foster a wiser and more peaceful human civilization, and produce authentic novelty and excitement to inspire all humanity, and I think even more than a Super Bowl football game. Steven Weinberg, the Nobel Prize winner, had something profound to say about this matter. He said that the effort to understand the universe is one of the few things that lifts human life a little above the level of farce. And we do engage in a lot of escapisms to avoid reality. We play a lot of games. And we are surrounded by billions and billions of stars in an endless universe of mystery. And that kind of makes us feel insignificant. And that's why we stay indoors with our own light and take selfies and watch games. And we do that a lot. And the fact of the matter is, 2/3 of the people in North America cannot see the glow of the Milky Way galaxy anymore because of our human-made lights, some of which come on automatically when the sun goes down. And you can say that we are hiding in our own light, both philosophically and factually speaking. But the good news is, when we make the commitment at the very moment we decide to explore our next door neighbor planet Mars to discover something about our place in the universe, some of those benefits will be immediate. And why and how some of those benefits can be immediate is explained by Nathaniel Brandon, where he writes that the only authentic basis of self-esteem is an unbreached determination to use one's mind to the fullest of one's ability and a refusal to ever evade one's knowledge or act against it. Now that takes some work and discipline to do that, but I believe it works. When we accomplish something by using our minds, we feel good. And one of the ways of using our minds to the fullest is to use the results of science or to do science. And that can be done in basically 3 ways. One is to predict and influence nature to produce life-enhancing technology. And we've done that a lot. We've surrounded ourselves with the results of science and technology. You know, we have cell phones, air conditioners, and now we're developing robots to do our work for us. A second way is to produce weapons to threaten or kill other humans, and we do that a lot too. A third way is a way that science began centuries ago, when we invented science to search for human meaning and identity. But unfortunately, we've largely pushed that aside in favor of the first two. But there's some good news about that too, because there seems to be some signs of a resurgence in using science to search for human meaning and identity. And a good example of that is a book entitled Science and the Quest for Meaning. It's written by Alfred I. Tauber, who is the Boston University professor of philosophy, and he also directs our History of Science program. And in that 2009 book, he wrote, "The role of science in defining personal identity cannot be overemphasized." In other words, we should be more aware of how we've surrounded ourselves with science and technology, and perhaps once again start using it to search for human meaning and identity. And Wernher von Braun, as you know, was the brilliant rocket scientist who designed the Saturn V rocket that sent us to the moon in 1969, had something to say about this matter. He said that by going into outer space, we will find ourselves. In other words, by exploring beyond our own planet, we will discover something new about our human identity. Now, what is human identity? Well, it's made up of many different factors, but some of the major ones are our gender, race, ancestral origins, language, nationality, occupation, religion, and we often use these to distinguish ourselves from other individuals. And sometimes we use these in ways that produce violent conflict. But another factor in our human identity is our place in the universe, and that points to our commonality. Now, what does exploring Mars have to do with our human identity? Well, obviously, one of the main things is life. If we were to discover a DNA life form on Mars, that would mean we're probably related to it, could have descended from it, and in a sense, we could even be Martians. On the other hand, if we were to discover a non-DNA life form on Mars, that would be some indication that we're not alone in the universe, that other life forms have evolved commonly throughout the universe, and perhaps some of them into other civilizations. And of course, our identity has a powerful influence on our behavior. We tend to behave according to who we think we are and what we think we can do. Now, here's one small example of how that works. The Pastor Terry Jones of the Dove World Outreach Church apparently felt that his religious identity was threatened by the existence of the Quran. So he held a public burning of the Quran back in 2011. And apparently people around on the other side of the world in Afghanistan felt that that burning of a Quran threatened their religious identity, and they responded with protests and killings and suicide bombings. And as we all know, that's still going on today. Now, Amartya Sen from India, who won the Nobel Prize in economics, kind of summarizes this phenomena in his book entitled Identity and Violence, where he writes that many of the conflicts and barbarities in the world are sustained through the illusion of a unique and choiceless identity, and that results in homespun elemental violence or globally artful violence and terrorism. And of course, a lot of that is going on today. In fact, there was a 2012 Pew report that showed that there is religion-related terrorism in 1/5 of all nations of the world. And now it's probably more than that. But Amartya Sen says the solution to this problem is to see ourselves as planetary citizens, and that a global identity can begin to receive its due without eliminating our other loyalties. In other words, we can see ourselves as planetary citizens, but retain our nationality, our language, and our religion, and all of that. Now, I made this cartoon to reflect and illustrate the most common response I hear when I do this presentation, and I've done it, I think, around 35 times in different places. It's two guys talking on the Earth. The first one says, before we waste money on sending people to Mars, we need to solve problems here on Earth. And the second guy says, yeah, we need to wait until we are finished killing each other with trillion-dollar wars to prove whose God is really God. And I've been informed by several people that that's too true to be funny. And I think they're right, because it happens a lot. And this chart here gives an indication of how much money we spend on the military. And this is the 2015 discretionary federal budget. Shows the military getting 55% of it, and NASA gets that tiny little sliver there, 1.5%. And another way of looking at how much money we spend on space exploration is to look at the salary of Charles Bolden, the NASA administrator, receives $179,000 a year. Now that's a decent salary, isn't it? But compare that to Nick Saban, the Alabama football coach. He receives over $7 million a year. And you know, there are lots of public institutions of higher learning that pay their coaches multi-million-dollar salaries. So the point is, if we were as interested in exploring our next door neighbor planet Mars as we are in the game of football, we would already be there. Now, back in 1960, Marshall McLuhan saw all these communication satellites being launched around the world and interconnecting the world with instantaneous communication. And he coined the term global village. And not too long after that, the astronaut Edgar Mitchell kind of confirmed that concept when he said that seeing the Earth from space produced instant global consciousness, and I came back to Earth no longer an American citizen, but a planetary citizen. And several other astronauts have expressed very similar thoughts. And Dr. Jill Tarter, an astronomer, recently made the comment that we are all Earthlings. We owe it to each other to celebrate our commonality rather than our perceived differences. And this is a common theme among people who think about what lies beyond the Earth. And there was a study back in 2008 that showed that more people are seeing themselves as planetary citizens, especially younger people. But when we went to the moon in 1969, it was just a race between the U.S. and the Soviets. And when we got there, we planted the flag of the U.S. on the moon. But I'm thinking it would have been more diplomatic and more beneficial to all humanity if we had planted the flag of Earth on the moon, just as these guys are doing here at the South Pole in the Antarctica. Now, the Reverend Dr. Fraser Watts, a professor of theology and science, back in 2006, made the comment that science is the most genuinely international movement in the world order and therefore a force for peace and stability. And a good example of that is the Large Hadron Collider near Geneva, Switzerland, supported by 60 different nations, including the United States. And they recently announced that they found the fundamental particle of the universe, the Higgs boson particle. And this kind of international cooperation in science will allow all humanity to better understand how the universe actually works from a scientific viewpoint. And of course, on the other hand, we humans compete a lot. We've been living in a global economy now for several decades, and there's competition for NASA contracts. And probably most of you can guess where this NASA pin that I have on my lapel was manufactured. Anybody want to guess? Absolutely, China. It was manufactured in China. But a mission to Mars should be a cooperative effort, not a competition between nations. And Martin Nowak did some research recently on cooperation, He had an article in the July 2012 issue of Scientific American entitled The Evolution of Cooperation, where he wrote that instead of opposing competition, cooperation has operated alongside it from the get-go to shape the evolution of life on Earth. In other words, we humans are as successful as we are because we have evolved to cooperate as well as compete. And Catherine Newell, who lectures on religion and science, back in 2012, asked a very profound question. She asked, what would happen if the exploration of the real frontier of Mars was portrayed as a triumph of global scientific cooperation? And that's exactly what I'm suggesting that we endeavor to answer. We endeavor to answer that question. Now, here's something I found very surprising. John Logsdon wrote a book in 2010 entitled John F. Kennedy and the Race to the Moon. And he found that in 1963, Kennedy proposed sending representatives of all countries to the moon with a global approach to space exploration. And that Kennedy asked, why should man's first flight to the moon be a matter of national competition? And also that Kennedy was in the process of negotiating to do this with Khrushchev when he was assassinated. Now, back in 2006, NASA Ames Research Center held a conference made up of mostly younger people. And one of their major conclusions was that international collaboration is not only vital to sending humans to Mars, but should be one of the most important reasons for going in the first place. In other words, if we accomplish nothing else by sending humans to Mars, we should do it on a cooperative basis in order to reduce some of this ridiculous, expensive conflict between nations. And several leaders in space exploration have made comments similar to this. Paul Hill, Robert Caswell, Michael Rafferty, and Patrick Troutman have all indicated that international cooperation is essential to sending humans to Mars. And there are lots of examples of international cooperation going on in space now. Of course, we have the Mars Society, which brings participants from all over the world. And in 2012, there was a simulated mission to Mars in Moscow with a crew of Russians, Chinese, Frenchmen, and Colombian. And the Russians have expressed a desire to have a joint mission with the United States. And the ExoMars project is a cooperative effort between the Europeans and the Russians to send up a Mars orbiter lander in 2018. And the Mars 1 has so far, last time I checked, received citizen donations from 107 different nations. And that tells me there's lots of worldwide interest in sending humans to Mars. And of course, we have the International Space Station with 16 nations cooperating. And the Chinese have asked to join. Unfortunately, the United States Congress excluded China, saying they were a security risk. And the Russians have been providing transportation up to the space station now for several years. And back in 2 weeks before the Curiosity rover landed on Mars, I did a at-random survey on the streets of northwest Arkansas, where I found that 47 people out of 50 didn't know anything about the Curiosity rover. And that tells me that probably a humans to Mars mission would draw much more interest than a robotic mission. And this last July 2015, I did another survey approaching 200 people in the 8 central U.S. states, and I asked them this question. I asked them, do you think it would be a good idea to create a worldwide cooperative mission to send a crew representing all citizens of Earth to explore our next door neighbor planet Mars? And 34.5% said no, and some of them said it really loud. But 65.5% said yes. And that tells me in this country, United States, that a significant majority would be in favor of an internationally supported mission to Mars. 65.5%. I was surprised. Now, Jeffrey Bennett, an astrophysicist who has written several articles about astronomy, wrote that a little perspective on our place in the universe makes any form of geographic, ethnic, or religious hatred seem just plain ridiculous. And that we can grow up and solve our problems only by exploring the universe beyond the Earth. In other words, we're not ever going to become a truly wise and mature civilization until we explore beyond our own planet. So, an international mission to Mars should invite every nation to participate at whatever level they're capable of. And every continent needs to be represented by a crew member, and all of the proceedings need to be translated into all the major languages of the world so that everyone feels included. And it could be the ultimate live television report from the crew as they leave the Earth, approach Mars, walk on the red dust of our next door neighbor planet Mars, and then begin to return to the Earth. I think such a live television report from the crew would inspire all humanity. So, an international Humans to Mars mission can help civilize Earth in these ways. Lift human life to a higher level of authenticity, cultivate a global human identity core, increase our human self-esteem and confidence, share mission costs among nations, encourage worldwide science education, create jobs and prosperity, produce authentic novelty and excitement to inspire all humanity, and in the end, foster a wiser and more peaceful human civilization. So, that's it. Yes.
Thank you for mentioning astronaut Mitchell. As you know, Mitchell and Von Braun teamed up after a mission in room 2 formed the Noetic Institute of California to raise consciousness to communicate on Earth and in space.
I've seen that. Yeah. Yes, back there. Yeah, well, it will some. It will a little bit. It may be slow, but you're in the 34.5% that said no, and there were 65.5% that said yes. I disagree. Yes. Sure. Well, certainly a lot of people who've thought about this say it will change everything, and it will. It will be facing reality, and we don't know what that reality is right now. But a lot of, I think, really hard-thinking scientists have said that more than likely there are other civilizations out there, and some of them may be more advanced than we are. So, but we need. I'm sorry. Oh, I suppose it's possible to find some ancient artifacts there, but we don't know that. That's one of the reasons to go there. Anybody else? Yes. How do we get out of our own way? Well, the thing I've observed is I only gave a few examples of cooperation going on in space exploration now. There's lots of cooperation or collaboration, which I think is about the same. I think we just need to become more aware, and I'm not sure what kind of organization it would take to do this, but, you know, since we're already, well, how long have we been depending on the Russians to give us a ride up to the space station? And you know, they're supposed to be our enemy, right? But they're giving us a ride up to the space station. And was it a good idea for Congress to exclude China, one of the largest nations on the planet? Why did they do that? But yeah, we're paying for it. Yeah, you'll have to pay for it. Any other questions? Yes. Well, the Russians, as I mentioned, have expressed a desire to have a joint mission to send humans to Mars. I think it's probably been 3 years since they did that. And I'm not sure what their objective was, but the Chinese wanted to join in on the space station. And I've also read where, well, yeah, maybe the U.S. will exclude China from the U.S. Part of the space station, but the Russians may go ahead and invite the Chinese. You know, I think the United States needs to wake up a little bit about us being such an exceptional nation. We need to realize we are living in a global village now for all intents and purposes, and I have this little thing in my pocket that I can potentially contact a good portion of people all over the world. That's just one example. Okay, that